For decades, people have argued about the minimum wage, the least amount of money workers need to be legally paid for every hour they work. Some say increasing the minimum wage can help workers because they can take more money home. But others argue that businesses would be compelled to cut jobs if the minimum wage increases. So who's right? Hi, I'm Anusha Nath, a senior research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and I've partnered with professors at the University of Minnesota, Lucas Carabarbonis, and Cornell University, Jeremy Lees, to exactly answer this question. So what do? We look at minimum wage increases right here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Way back in 2017, Minneapolis and St. Paul increased their minimum wage to $15. Minneapolis announced it and started implementing it in 2018. But St. Paul soon after announced it in 2018, but did not start implementing it in 2020. Now remember that detail. I'll come back to that later. Now here's the minimum wage increase in the Twin Cities. How do we measure the effect of increase in minimum wage, say on jobs? Well, one thing we could do is naively look at jobs after the minimum wage and look at jobs before the minimum wage and compare the two. Now, does that really tell us the true effect of the minimum wage? Not really. Why not? Because other things could be changing. It could be that the economy is changing overall, and maybe there's a decline in the overall economy. Or maybe there's a new app that makes workers more efficient. Or maybe there's a pandemic. Now, when these events happen, we cannot really tell if the jobs change because of the minimum wage or one of these other things happening. So what do economists do? We try and take the Minneapolis city or St. Paul and find a lookalike. We want to compare apples to apples. Now, how do we find the lookalike? We take all the cities which did not have a minimum wage change and try and sort of put pieces of them together to create a Minneapolis lookalike. So what happens in Minneapolis and the lookalike would exactly be the same before the policy change. So what happens after the policy change is Minneapolis would have had the policy change and the lookalike didn't. And so when we compare the two, the difference between the two will tell us the true effect of the minimum wage. So that's exactly what we do. We find a lookalike for Minneapolis and a lookalike for St. Paul. And then we compare the two after the policy change. And doing this, here's what we found. We found that wages do go up and workers benefit, but it comes at a cost. We see that jobs went down, hours worked also declined, and the total earnings, the amount of money people actually take home, also fell. Now, not everybody got affected the same way. Restaurant industries got especially hit hard. By the end of 2021, if you look at all of Minneapolis, jobs had fallen down by 2.7% compared to 2017. But in the restaurant industries, the jobs fell by 32%. Let that sink in, 32%. Why? Why is the job fall so large in restaurants and not so much in the other industries? Well, the reason is because restaurant industries were paying, businesses in this industry were paying their workers way below $15. And when the Minneapolis and St. Paul minimum wage jumped up from $8.22 to $15, businesses had to pay their workers a lot more. And especially the restaurants had to pay their workers a lot more compared to all other businesses in the local economy. Now, so this means that the restaurants and the workers working here were more exposed to the minimum wage policy. And we find this pattern everywhere. The more the businesses had to pay their workers more to comply with this new policy, the more jobs they cut. Now, do you remember that I told you that St. Paul announced its policy in 2018, but didn't start implementing till 2020? Well, something strange happened in those 2 years. Wages did not change, but businesses started cutting jobs. Why? Well, businesses saw what was coming. They knew they had to eventually pay their workers much more. So even though the policy didn't start changing, they started adjusting. They started laying off their workers. But why did they not pay their workers even though they started cutting jobs? Well, because they didn't have to legally. Now, in Minneapolis, on the other hand, because the announcement came very close to when they started actually changing or implementing the policy on the ground, things changed. Wages went up, jobs went down. So what's the bottom line? What we learned from our study is that some workers benefited from the policy, but it came at a cost. There were job losses, especially in industries like restaurants, where a lot of businesses were highly exposed to the minimum wage. So this tells us that even the most well-intentioned policies can have trade-offs. and real trade-offs affect real people. And we really need to take into account these trade-offs when we design and implement new policies.